Welcome everyone to UUP's Black History Celebration event. I am Darlene Mayers, co-chair of the statewide Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee representing SUNY Farmingdale, and I am excited to be here with you all today. During this month, UUP has provided some amazing events to celebrate Black History Month. During our first event, speakers talked about the importance for UUP and all unions to come together and share experiences, knowledge, and solidarity between Black history and labor. We then held a panel discussion on why Black America should get vaccinated against COVID-19, how COVID-19 is hurting all communities, but not equally, and bringing to light the various barriers that cause vaccine hesitancy and access. Today, our panelists will discuss key issues related to health, economic, and environmental justice, and how these issues disproportionately impact communities of color. They will also share ways of getting involved in efforts to improve environmental, physical, mental, and overall community health outcomes. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone when you sign in, please indicate your chapter. I thank you for joining us, and now I'm handing the mic over to our statewide president, Fred Kowal.
Thanks again, Darlene. And I want to acknowledge your efforts and the efforts of Patrick Romaine, the other co-chair of the DEI committee for UUP, and for all the members of the committee, and all of those who have been a part of the work of putting this together. Danielle Judge Freeman, our UUP staff, and others on staff who have done such great work to make these events happen. And as I have said at the previous two events, these are simply the beginning. This union is committed to being a leading institution in bringing about racial justice throughout our country and our world. But you know, in order for us to take on that work, the first place we have to start is within our own organization, indeed, within our own lives and our own hearts and minds. And that effort is also just getting started. And all of us who are UUP members, all of us who are on this panel today or are joining as audience members have to be a part of this work. It is so crucial and so important that for UUP to lead the way on racial justice, we must make sure that ourselves, our own organization, overcomes its own history of racism and exclusion. And so the work is just beginning. And it's vitally important. You know, the panel you're going to hear from today, and I do want to thank all of you who are joining us today. This is really a remarkable panel. I was joking beforehand that I want to keep my comments short because I want to hear from all three panel participants, and then to see what questions you might have. Feel free to put those questions in the chat, and hopefully we can get to as many as possible. But you know, as a higher ed union, we have come face to face with a very bizarre manifestation of the racism that has existed in our country for so long. I'm sure almost all of us have heard about the controversy, quote unquote, about critical race theory. And it is such a Trojan horse, it's a smokescreen for really what those who are raising concerns, quote unquote, about this aspect of legal theory. Really, it's all about trying to stop the conversation that has to take place, the careful and very painful examination of our nation's history. You know, this past weekend, two events took place that just brings into stark relief what we face in higher ed and in the work that we try to do in educating each other and ourselves about our history and our history of racism and violence. First was the Lieutenant Governor of Texas publicly stating that faculty members in the University of Texas system who teach critical race theory should lose their tenure. And if they haven't gotten it, they should never be eligible for tenure. This is an attempt to silence scholarship, examination, teaching, the search for truth and for wisdom. And it's startling, but not shocking, because we've seen incidents like this happening all over the education systems in the United States. It's appalling that it continues well into the 21st century. The other thing was an anniversary, a terrible anniversary. February 20th, 1922, 100 years ago this past weekend, the state of Mississippi, the Senate in the state of Mississippi, passed a resolution. I made note of the vote. The vote was 25-9 in the Mississippi state legislature. What did they pass? They passed a resolution calling on the federal government to undertake an operation to remove all Black residents from the United States to somewhere in Africa. Yeah, colonization. You know, as someone who off and on used to teach American history, I specialize in Native American studies and American politics. But, you know, it was always a part of the course to talk about the colonization drive in the 19th century. But we need to know our history, that the attempt to exclude, remove, however you want to term, deny the humanity and the presence of the diverse races in our society. It is a modern phenomenon, and it just does not end. That is what we are up against. It is something that we have to face as a nation, as a university system, as a union, and as human beings attempting. We have to do more than attempt, we have to succeed. And it's a long journey. I keep using that reference point for our union and for ourselves, and certainly as a nation. But it's the work that must be done. And so let me give you a little bit of background as we start this work. The beginning is to listen and to learn. And so who are we going to hear from today? Well, to begin with, joining us from the University at Buffalo is Dr. Henry Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning there. His research focuses on a historical and contemporary analysis of distressed urban neighborhoods, social isolation, and race and class issues among people of color, especially African Americans and Latinos. Taylor's research also focuses on these issues in Cuba, the Caribbean islands, and Latin America. Lastly, Dr. Taylor is concerned with the redevelopment of shrinking cities and metropolitan cities with a focus on social, economic, and racial justice. Also joining us is the Reverend George F. Nicolas, senior pastor of Lincoln Memorial United Methodist Church in Buffalo, New York. Pastor Nicolas is a long-standing advocate for social justice and community revitalization. He is also a founding member of Concerned Clergy Coalition of Western New York, a member of African American Health Equity Task Force, which birthed a Buffalo Center for Health Equity, in which Pastor George is the chairman. Pastor George is also on the executive committee of the board of the Population of Health Collaborative and a member of the African American Health Disparities Task Force. Our third panelist speaking today is Dr. Lemire Teran. He is an assistant professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, ESF. His field of study lies at the intersection of environmental science, social justice, and ecological sustainability. As an environmental justice professor, Dr. Teran's research, classroom teaching, and community engagement focuses on the study of environmental justice, which is the movement to end systemic environmental harm acted upon marginalized populations. I invite all of us who are here, as we listen, as we learn, to share any questions that you may have in the chat. If there is time at the end of the presentation, it is our intent to open up to those questions. If we run out of time, we will ask panelists to help us in answering the questions as part of our post-event follow-up with registrants. And again, for all of you who are UUP members, stay tuned. There is going to be information about the next steps we are taking as a union to be a part of the work of racial, social, and environmental justice that you're going to hear a lot about in the next 45 minutes. So with that, I would like to turn things over to our colleague from the University of Buffalo, Dr. Taylor. The virtual microphone is yours, Doctor.
Thank you, Fred. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today and to share some of my thoughts with you. The historian Carol Anderson, in her award-winning book, Eyes Off the Prize, posed a provocative question, which I paraphrase. How could all the blood, all the courage, and all the martyrs of the civil rights movement still leave in its wake a nation where schools are more segregated than ever, where more than half of all children live in poverty, and where the life expectancy of Blacks have actually declined, and where millions are trapped in neighborhoods that cause unnecessary disease, needless suffering, and premature death? Anderson was wondering why Blacks remained in a subordinate position in American society more than 50 years after passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I argue that Blacks have made minimal socioeconomic progress since the Civil Rights era because of racial residential segregation operating within the context of neoliberal capitalism and government complicity. Racial residential segregation is more than a process of separating Blacks and whites in geographic space. It is a market-driven system of denying Blacks equitable access to education, specialized training, jobs, income, wealth, and critical services and experiences that bolster their life chances. A mountain of research on neighborhood effects demonstrates that market-driven, geographically based social determinants produce undesirable health and socioeconomic outcomes among Blacks. Moreover, in neoliberal America, the purpose of these underdeveloped neighborhoods is to produce a class of workers that are willing to accept jobs with low wages and limited benefits. Consequently, Blacks cannot make significant socioeconomic progress and abolish health inequities without dismantling residential segregation and simultaneously turning their neighborhoods into great places to live, work, play, and raise a family. Thus, we must center the destruction of residential segregation and the transformation of underdeveloped neighborhoods in our quest to build a better, more democratic, and just America. I want to stress that African Americans play a heavy price for being segregated in residential spaces. Now, policymakers and the mass media typically portray Black communities as disadvantaged and poor places that are the sites of disinvestment and concentrated poverty. I reject this characterization. These underdeveloped neighborhoods are sites of consumption where predatory investment and exploitative activities occur. I refer to this combination of economic activities as Predonomics, which occur in places where residents have limited housing, shopping, and other consumption options. Predonomics includes a broad range of activities that extract wealth from the Black community, including excessive fines and fees, high prices for shoddy goods and services, as well as the creation of job opportunities for white workers. By this, I mean to say that street paving, sidewalk improvements, demolitions, home construction, and the installment of sewer and water pipes in Black communities typically provide employment opportunities for whites rather than the residents who live in these neighborhoods. And I'm not even beginning to mention the numerous jobs provided for teachers, social service workers, and the police, all delivering services to these African American and Latinx communities. This is Predonomics in action. Because of time limits, I want to focus my remaining remarks on the substandard housing problem. The substandard housing problem is the bedrock of underdevelopment in the Black community. It consists of two interrelated components: rent gouging and low quality housing. In New York State, about 69% of Blacks are renters. Many of these African Americans pay 40% or more of their income on housing, including many rental units that are substandard. These renters are the victims of rent gouging, meaning that they pay excessive rents for low quality housing units. This rent gouging is a serious issue because it makes it difficult for households to afford the rents and reduces income to pay for other essentials, such as food, clothing, medicine, and transportation. These excessive rents are a significant driver of neighborhood instability and toxic stress in the Black community. The high rents catalyze forced moves, including evictions and unforced moves driven by the desire to find better and cheaper housing. Such high numbers of forced and unforced moves produce residential instability, and residential instability brings other forms of instabilities in families, in schoolings, and daily life. I mean, many of the educational problems that young Black kids face result from this residential instability. Moreover, worrying about paying rent, having to move and find a new place to live, generate toxic levels of stress, triggering a range of health issues, including low birth weight babies and infant mortality. Now, rent gouging is directly tied to substandard housing. In a pioneering study, the Princeton scholar Matthew Desmond and Nathan Wilmers from MIT found that property owners made hyper profits by reducing maintenance and upkeep on their rental properties. Moreover, the property value and tax burdens are lower in underdeveloped neighborhoods, thereby inflating profits even more. This combination of rent gouging and substandard housing is part of a broader issue of unequal neighborhood development, and they are the drivers of neighborhood instability and health issues among African Americans. The substandard housing problem underpins neighborhood development and is the prime driver of health inequity in the Black community. Yet, policymakers and many activists do not center it in their fight to transform the Black community. Instead, many groups focus on building new affordable housing units or expanding home ownership among Blacks. The problem is that most Blacks currently live in existing substandard housing units. City planners and developers will never produce enough new housing units to replace the existing substandard rental housing units. They have to rehabilitate them. For example, in Buffalo, over a 20-year period, the total number of new builds constituted less than 5% of the total number of rental housing units in the Black community. On the flip side, the idea of expanding Black home ownership is sound. It's a good strategy, but it will never resolve the issue of neighborhood underdevelopment, nor will it close the wealth gap. The reason is twofold. First, in the Black community, owner-occupied and rental units share residential space. In this setting, substandard rental property always depresses the value of owner-occupied units. Therefore, given their location, housing values in the Black community will appreciate at a much lower rate. Second, residential land valuation is a racist system where the value of white homes is based on the devaluation of Black homes. In this system, as the percentage of whites and social class exclusivity increases in a neighborhood, housing values and the wealth-producing capacities of those communities increase. Likewise, as the percentage of Blacks and social class inclusivity increases, housing values and the wealth-producing capacities of those communities decrease. Thus, even when Black homeowners live in upscale Black communities, their homes are still valued less than comparable homes owned by whites. The bottom line is that you can run, but you cannot hide from the problem of underdeveloped Black neighborhoods and substandard housing. I repeat, you cannot solve the socioeconomic and health challenges facing African Americans without radically transforming underdeveloped Black neighborhoods and dramatically improving the existing quality of rental housing units. You can try, but you will fail. I want to conclude by reminding us that underdeveloped neighborhoods and substandard housing is about more than just economic issues. These neighborhoods and substandard houses cause disease, unnecessary pain and suffering, and premature death. Concurrently, these neighborhoods function as social factories designed to produce workers willing to accept low-wage jobs with limited benefits. In other words, in neoliberal capitalist society, the underdeveloped neighborhood functions as a structural mechanism that keeps Black in a subordinate societal position, thus answering Carol Anderson's provocative question. For these reasons, we cannot create an equitable and just society without transforming these underdeveloped neighborhoods and rehabilitating substandard housing while simultaneously dismantling racial residential segregation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. You have gotten us off to a remarkable start. That was incredibly good, informative, but more than that, energizing. It is the central question that you started us with, and I've gotten a dialogue going. So thank you for kicking us off very well. With that, I'm going to turn to our next speaker, the Pastor George Nicolas. And Pastor, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Kowal, and thank you all of my friends this morning. I'm gonna go right into it. As you know, that my name is Pastor George Nicolas, and I have the honor and the privilege of being the chair of the African American Health Equity Task Force, and also the Buffalo Center for Health Equity and the UB Community Health Research Institute Advisory Council. When we talk about these issues about inequality, race, and for me, the social determinants of health, as Dr. Taylor talked about residential segregation, we must not be afraid to confront these issues, but understanding that we come from a position of power. Sometimes we think we allow for policymakers and elected officials and others to think that they run things, but no, we must take the power. And the great Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton, said these words: the people have to have the power. It belongs to the people. Now, one of the things that happened in the American experience as we talk about racial inequalities, and again, specifically about health disparities, we must understand that health disparities are not something that are a result of divine activity. It's a result of human activity. And the story of the American Republic is one in which when we talk about, it's not a race problem, it's a racism or an anti-Black racism problem that has been in existence in the American story right from its inception. Even before the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, documents that would govern the Republic were written. Documents were written on how to govern or to control Black bodies. And one of them was the South Carolina Act, part of the Negro Acts, that regulated how enslaved Africans would be treated. And you see here, whereas the having of slaves taught to write or suffering them to be employed in writing may be attended with great inconveniences, but it enacted that all and every person and persons, whoever they shall be, thereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slave as a scribe or any manner of writing whatsoever, here they are taught to write, such a person or person shall for such offense forfeit the sum of 100 pounds in current money. They understood the power of education. And many of you work in educational institutions, and you can see just from the eye test around you, the inequalities and the brokenness within our system at the local level. And then as it go into the higher educational level, there's tremendous opportunity gaps, not achievement gaps, but opportunity gaps that exist between Black and white students. And those are part of the social determinants of health. Now, what I would like to argue this morning quickly is there have been 4 great moments in American history, 4 great opportunities for us to deal with equity. One was after the Civil War and the time of Reconstruction, and there was that brief period where there was an opportunity for African Americans to achieve prosperity and success in this country. But then when Rutherford B. Hayes pulled the troops out of the South, all of that went away. And then the New Deal beginning, the New Deal that happened. And then there was redlining. So even the great work of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not able to be experienced by all Americans, and because even as a result of the New Deal, there was baked in racism and inequality within that system. And then the Johnson's Great Society program in 1964 was a great opportunity with the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill and all of those things happening. But there was not an emphasis on trying to change the economic situation that existed, which was the outcome of many years of enslavement, Jim Crow, and all the different things that happened in this country. And Dr. King would say there's nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, that we have the resources to get rid of it. And then the fourth move is what I would call the post-COVID move, the season that we're in right now, with all the George Floyd assassination and the civil unrest and upheaval that we have, along with COVID, which exposed the social determinants of health, or exposed the racial inequalities, the disparities between Blacks and whites as it relates to health outcomes. We saw in America that African Americans were dying at 2 to 3 times higher of their population rate as a result of COVID. And that was because of the pre-existing conditions or the health disparities that already existed. And we saw those with asthma, with hypertension, heart disease, and other chronic diseases that were prevalent or more prevalent in African Americans because of the social determinants of health. Now, why do I have this slide up here? When we talk about, we have to have a real conversation. If we really want to have really want to address these issues about anti-Black racism in America, we must understand that it's not just something that is on the fringes or something that you'll see in the Deep South or other places like this. This is an American problem that has existed from its inception and that it is still very prevalent today. Those of you who are concerned or were concerned about the election of Donald Trump and the reemergence or the backlash against the 8 years of having a Black president in this country, we got to be clear, that's what it is, all right? I get so sick and tired of folks that are supposed to be on our side, allies, who want to bring in all these other conversations about why white folks voted for Donald Trump. White folks voted for Donald Trump because of white supremacy. And we have to understand that, and we have to acknowledge that so that we can address it. And if you look at this slide, it shows that if it were not for the vote of Black and brown people in this country, if it was just up to white Americans, we would have an extreme right-wing racist government that would systematically dismantle the rights of Black people. And be very clear about this. These folks are also very anti-union. It's amazing to me that people who were union members would be voting for this kind of reactionary and just really racist kinds of regime. But we got to call it what it is so that we can address it, so that we can deal with it. Now, because of these policies that have been in existence in this country from the inception, African Americans have suffered just incredibly. When you look at every health indicator, whether it be cancer, whether it be hypertension, whether it be diabetes, whether it be asthma, whatever the health outcome, maternal health, every health indicator shows that African Americans suffer a tremendous disparity. And when you think about it, you have to understand it's not because of the inherent physiological deficiencies of African people living in America. It's because of social systems. And the World Health Organization is very clear in how the issue of having every citizen having the access and the ability to have good health is a human right. And our health outcomes are determined or impacted by the social determinants of health. Now, one of the things you see in that definition, the social determinants of health have an important influence on health inequities, the unfair and avoidable differences in health status seen within and between countries, and countries at all levels of income, health, and illness follow a social gradient that lower the social economic position, the worse the health. And so these are the social determinants of health, and we know what these things are. And as Dr. Taylor so eloquently pointed out, housing is one of those things. It's a big driver. But when you look at all of these things, they're all impacted and influenced by public policy. That there are decisions that are made at the government level, the decisions that are made at the corporate level that impact all of these social determinants of health. And they have never centered the needs of Black people as a priority in these policy decisions. Let me show you why, and show you another outcome. Here we are living today, that the wealth gap in America is at some of its worst that we've seen in our lifetime. So in spite of what we have perceived or some have perceived has been progress, the results or the outcomes do not demonstrate that these types of legislative initiatives and other things have really been able to change the real life experiences of African people living in America. So my final thought here is this: we have to fight for equity, you know, and as you remember, going back to our slide that the only reason that Democrats win in New York State, or the only reason that a Democrat can win a national election, is not because of the white vote. It's because of the black vote. It's just that's what it is. Now, when will the policymakers center the needs of the most loyal constituency in the making of their policy? So here's our dynamic right now, and all this relates to the social determinants of health, right? And now, so we have like three things that were kind of big things that were happening in our government this year, right? Now, in terms of a priority, the first priority should have been the voting rights bill. Why? Well, because we see that African Americans are the most loyal voting bloc, but more importantly, the health conditions of African Americans, the fact that we're living in some communities, if you live in some communities, in Black communities in the city of Buffalo, you'll live 10 to 12 less years than a white person that doesn't live in those communities. The birth outcomes, as Dr. Taylor talked about, our Black women are 3 and 4 times more likely to have negative birth outcomes than white women. Now, policies, right, impact the resources that can go into communities, that can change the quality of life for individuals and impact systems, so in order to change those dynamics. However, if people of color are not given equal opportunities to vote, and if voter suppression continues, then these numbers that we saw previously about African Americans able to influence elections for candidates that are not so, you know, that are so abusive to people, working people and people of color, then we're going to have a real problem. But it was the decisions of the Democrats to not prioritize that, to not make that first. Instead, we were told again, well, you got to wait. Well, we're going to let us do infrastructure first. Well, infrastructure is going to help working white folks more than it's going to help anybody. And that's not a bad thing. But then what about Build Back Better? What about the other pieces of legislation that would impact our communities? And again, we are told to wait. We have to prioritize the needs of Black people. And not just Black people prioritizing, but our allies, those who benefit. We have a big governor's election coming up this year. There's no way the Democrat candidate's going to win that election in New York State, progressive New York State, unless Black people come out in big numbers in urban areas. But I've yet to hear the centering of the issues of health equity, health disparities, the needs of, as Dr. Taylor talked about, residential segregation, the poor outcomes for Black children in our public schools. I've yet to hear a clear plan forward and a prioritizing of those issues. And so we need right now, if we're serious, and this is that fourth moment, Reconstruction, the New Deal, the Great Society program, and now we're in this fourth movement. And so the question we must ask ourselves is this: are we going to do something new? Are we going to do something that's going to be transformative? Or are we going to go and do the same old thing and then expect the outcomes will be different? What Albert Einstein would warn us against that. And he would say, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. We're looking forward to working in collaboration with you into building a new society that will center the needs of the poor and the needs of Black and brown people as the center of our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pastor Nicolas. Excellent exposition of the challenges and the inherent structural problems and factors in the creation of white racism towards African Americans and the long-term impact. Thanks very much. And as you were talking about the social determinants of health, both in your comments and then also in Sarah Valentine's comment in the chat, provided us with a segue to our third presenter, who is going to be talking about just those areas, and that is specifically to environmental justice and the important struggle for that, how central it is, in my humble opinion. So now we turn to our colleague from ESF, Dr. Lemire Tehran. Doctor.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and put the share screen in full effect. All right, so I have a humble request after hearing that brilliance from Dr. Taylor and Pastor Nicolas. If you ever ask me to do anything related to UUP, don't ask me to go after those two. What do I have to offer after that? So I was humbled to be here today, but after hearing that, what substance can I add? But alas, I will try. So I initially was asked to speak about a paper that me and some colleagues did last year, looking at health inequality as relates to COVID-19 in New York City. And it should be no surprise, we did a study looking at all the boroughs, various neighborhoods across the city, and we found some very disturbing trends. We saw an inverse relationship between income and mortality. Higher your income, higher income neighborhoods, the lower the mortality of the neighborhood. Same thing with race, or a little bit different with race, more concentration, higher concentrations of Black folks in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, the higher the increased rates of morbidity. So I let our good colleague know, well, we can talk about COVID-19, but I'd love to broaden the conversation. Let's talk about environmental justice a little bit more broadly. And we can certainly talk about the pathways from the last slide. If you want to talk, as Pastor Nicolas said, if we want to talk about the social determinants of health, we can go there in Q&A. And we can talk about occupational hazards and comorbidities. We can definitely do that. But I want to talk a little bit more generally about my work in environmental justice. So before we arrive there today, let's talk about what is environmental justice. So EGA, as we call it in shorthand, is a movement that seeks to improve the environmental and health conditions and livelihoods of marginalized communities. It is a response against environmental racism, right? Targeted environmental marginalization based on racial lines. And then after the movement began in the late 70s, early 80s, then that certainly expanded to go in many other social directions. But it started as a direct result or a direct consequence of people fighting against environmental racism. So a very formal or classic definition I like to work off of by a good West Coast organization, APEN. EGA is the right to a decent, safe quality of life. And I think Dr. Taylor pretty much mentioned this a little bit earlier. The right to a decent, safe quality of life for people of all races, incomes, and cultures in the environments where, here's the rub, where we live, work, play, learn. I'm at an academic institution right now. I'm right down the street from an elementary school that is literally right next to an interstate, and also where we pray or where we partake in spiritual life. So we can't just think about who lives next to a Superfund site, who doesn't have access to a bike lane or green space. We got to think about the environment in the natural space, but also the built environment. Or you could say in shorthand, when I'm talking to young students, young persons, we go with the classical definition, but we can also understand environmental justice and claims for environmental justice within the context of how structural inequality influences environmental conditions. So let's talk about some examples. Here are two quick smatterings of my work. I do a lot with climate change. Specifically, I look at how is climate change going to mobilize legacy pollution. And when we're talking about legacy pollution, we're talking about things like Superfund sites, which are the most toxic, hazardous sites in this country. We're talking about things that like brownfields. There are so many brownfields in this country, we can't even quantify them. Best estimates somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 brownfields, could be substantially more. So one thing I've been doing over the past several years, what is it going to mean when you have the interface between climate change, specifically superstorms and flooding? What is that going to do to mobilize toxic sites? That's something that we should all be concerned about. Or think about the concentrated animal feeding operations that are very robust around New York State. Are you going to see the potential mobilization of hog lagoons as flooding increases, particularly in vulnerable areas, flood-prone areas? That's something we need to think about. Also do a lot of work with energy and what does a democratization of energy look like? What does an energy justice look like? When we think about climate change, a lot of times we're thinking about, hey, if we just get solar panels, then we can solve all our problems. If we can just get more EV charging stations, we can solve all of our problems. But we know that's not the case. We got to think about the built environment. We got to think about insecurity for households right now. We got to think about income discrepancies and people, particularly in a state like New York State. Every winter, people are getting punished when it comes to pay that winter natural gas bill, excuse me. So that's an environmental justice issue that I've been looking at over the past several years. And then maybe what I'm probably most known for, at least in this state, is you think about it, whoever's been to Syracuse, if you have driven on I81, which is this interstate that cuts, like many interstates in the East Coast and all around the country, elsewhere in the world as well, you have an interstate that literally dissects an historic Black neighborhood. So if you look at the map on your right, you can see my university, you see the world famous dome right there. And then at the lower right-hand corner, you can see SUNY College of Environmental Science. And look very closely, right under the dome, you can see my office. You see me waving at you? Maybe you laughed, I can't hear. I always get a good laugh when I tell that joke to my students online. But in any event, we think about I81 and how it cuts through. We put a neighborhood, or we put an interstate literally on top of a Black neighborhood. And that's not by accident, it's by design, because we know we can go to innumerable places all around the country. We can go to Syracuse, New York, Wilmington, Delaware, Philly, Rochester, Atlanta, Orlando, all around the country, we see the same pattern. And what I always say is you'll never understand, like in order for you to understand interstate siting, you got to know your history. And one example, when you start to think about neighborhoods that were primed for disinvestment, when you think about neighborhoods that were primed for targeting for locally unwanted land uses, you got to think about policy that was laid out in the first half of the 20th century. Things like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, it really sacrificed innumerable communities, but we know that the brunt of that activity happened against Black communities. So I say you'll never, unless you understand this, you'll never understand this right here. So this is right now, I81 in Syracuse is about to be redeveloped. This interstate is coming down. It looks like it's going to be a series of interconnecting streets. It's going to be replaced with what we call a boulevard. So it's no longer going to be an interstate dissecting a community. But look, just because you take down last year's horror, it doesn't mean that all the racial wounds are going to be healed. You got to start asking some serious questions. What does a restorative justice agenda look like, right? And it can't just be tied to we gave 200 people jobs in that neighborhood. So we got to ask some serious questions about environmental remediation, some serious questions about restorative justice. What do reparations look like in this case? And if we don't, then we're not serious about environmental justice. So this right here should never happen. As a matter of fact, There's a approximately 15,000 page environmental impact statement, draft statement, and it talks about the redevelopment of this site. And probably to everybody's horror, at least under the initial conception, when this interstate comes down, only half of this park is going to be closed. So you're talking about a $1.52 billion infrastructure project. That basketball court is going to be closed. But if you look at the playground to the far left, that's slated to be open. Like, that's the level of contempt that so many of the people, the designers, the project managers, the engineers, that they have for the Black children that live in neighborhoods like this. And when I meet these people, I ask them, I'm not a mouse. Like, would you let your child play next to a $2 billion construction project? I've never gotten a legitimate answer. So let's kind of close it out. And the real reason I came today, it wasn't to talk to you all about environmental justice, although that is why I was invited. Maybe I won't be invited back. I didn't come to answer questions. I came to ask some questions. So just in order, what's UUP's responsibility in all this? We're not going to solve climate inequality. We're not going to solve environmental inequality, but we certainly have a role to play. So the questions I want us dealing with, and we can talk about them now, but I want to have some more robust, sustained conversation that extends way past Black History Month. Where's labor in these questions, right? When you think about the rehabilitation of an interstate, but more importantly to us, because this is a higher ed union, where do we fit at when it comes to issues of racial inequality, and who's at the table? And this should really permeate every single thing we do. I challenge everybody here, start going and looking at who comprised of the different departments across SUNY or across UUP represented institutions, and start asking some legitimate questions. Who's at the table? Who's not at the table? And I always have a slide when I talk to different colleges around the country, because when I'm in environmental science spaces, it's so hard for sisters, Black women, to get jobs. I always ask, what do Black women have to do to get employed here? Now, I don't play into the cynical games, the politics of representation. You bring in one or two sisters and then all your problems are solved. But these are questions that they shouldn't just be asked at the institutional level. If UUP is not putting pressure and asking these type of questions, then it's not fulfilling its duty that Fred talked about a little bit earlier during his opening. I want to know, what is UUP's environmental justice policy? What is UUP's racial justice policy? So, certainly it's nice to have programs like this, but we got to do more. So if we don't have a policy, then we need to create one that goes beyond a piece of paper that's somewhere on the website. It needs to be undergirded by sustained action. And then finally, what are we asking of our affiliates? I was very fortunate. Very recently, one of our sister chapters, the New York Alliance for Retired Americans, asked me to come out. They wanted to talk about climate change. They wanted to talk about climate justice. So all of our affiliate organizations, you look at those first 3 bullet points, we also need to be asking those questions of the people who we are breaking bread with this. So you can sum up all these questions just simply, who are you? Who are we, right? Finally, if you want to know more, you want to read my papers, if they didn't put you to sleep, you can check them out. I put all my stuff because I believe in the democratization. I don't want to hide it behind a firewall. You can check out any paper, anything I've talked about today at my website, download it for free. If you're on social media, check me out at Twitter, and maybe we can have some more exchanges via that medium. So with that being said, I really appreciate your time today, and I will pass the mic back to our moderator, and hopefully we have some time for some Q&A. Thank you for your time, brothers and sisters.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Lemire. And excellent questions that you closed with. They are the kind of questions that I think that we all need to be challenging ourselves with. And the quick answer to all of those questions is that the officers of this union, the committees that work on DEIJ, I always add the J onto DEI because it's imperative that be part of the conversation. It is about justice. That our committees that represent our members most closely work with us, and we provide the support so that we can generate the means by which we as a union are committed and active on the issues of racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice. I think that these programs that sprang out of the work of our DEI committee is really pointing in a direction where we want to go. It cannot come from me. It cannot come from my fellow officers. It really needs to be organic within the union at large for it to have the real staying power that's going to be needed to fight these battles, specifically on environmental justice. It's why UUP, among all unions, really from private sector and public sector, we are really the only union that has proposed for New York State, for SUNY, really well thought out proposals to address the climate crisis through an addressing of environmental injustice. And those proposals are always looked upon as a little bit out of the ordinary, but that's because, and I think I will dare to speak for my fellow officers, we have to be more than what I like to say, more than just a union talking about a contract, benefits, salaries. We have to take on the bigger issues facing a society. Otherwise, we're not responsible members of that society. So there is a lot to be done and a lot of work that has to be done by all of us. And I welcome everyone's thoughts, ideas, concerns, criticisms, support, whatever. This has got to be a dynamic and open conversation. So with that, Darlene, I don't know if we had questions or if there were any that you wanted to bring to our panel. Why don't you go ahead?
There are several beautiful comments in the chat. My goodness. Patrick, are you on?
Yes, I'm on.
Okay, this is Patrick's point of the program. Go ahead, Patrick.
And I wanted to go with Kevin Cuby's construction waste dumping on Long Island and Brentwood Park, which is a multiracial community. There's a very good example of environmental inequity, and an event that really opened my eyes to environmental injustice. And that's one of them. Lisa, Stephen, I think this is very important too. UB is hosting a major global conference, engineering education largely targeted to continuing education, but it has a significant DEI slot, including social justice, and went further. So I think there's thank you so much for the questions. The presentations were absolutely motivational. So I want to thank Dr. Henry Taylor, Pastor George Nicolas, and Dr. Lemire Tavat. Thank you so much. This was absolutely motivational. I'm so happy that we celebrated for the first time. So DEI celebrated Black History Month, and we started off with the inaugural kickoff with Dr. Reverend Terrence L. Melvin and Dr. Anthony Rendridge, and they talked about Black history in the labor movement, correct? And then we went on to why Black America should get vaccinated by Dr. Camille Clear and Dr. Drudge, right? And then your presentation. So this was absolutely moving. And I reaffirm my commitment to this because this is so important. I grew up in Brooklyn and I lived this. This was my day-to-day existence. You brought up an issue about homes. Like I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. And so if I sell my house, even though I live in that neighborhood, because I'm Black, they would offer me less for my house, regardless of the neighborhood, right? I think that's some of the research that came out as well. So I don't know if any one of you would like to answer that or address that.
Yeah, there's a lot that we're beginning to, that we're still trying to sort out in relationship to the appraisal process, because we have several different dynamics. At one level, because historically and in the contemporary age, African Americans and typically people of color are located on the most undesirable residential lands. The houses and the homes that they have are valued less. But again, I always like to go back. You cannot overemphasize enough the role that the existing land valuation system plays. that the very way in which land value was developed inside of the United States is based upon a combination of whiteness and exclusivity, and they work together hand in hand. The other thing I want to highlight, because there wasn't time to talk about it in the conversation, I want to stress that in this racist society, we also have to understand that education itself is not a holy grail. That racism denies Blacks opportunities, even when the educational boundaries are there. If I can, let me show you this slide. This is a Buffalo, New York. And we rank ordered all 28 municipalities in Erie County by educational attainment. And you see that Buffalo is right in the middle of Pat in terms of the percentage of its population with a college degree or higher. But when we drop to income, all of these places have housing values that are higher and medium household incomes that are higher. And I'm not talking about just higher, but significantly higher. So the point I'm making is that when Blacks don't have a college degree, but some high school and some college, it means something fundamentally and radically different when that same scenario exists among whites. Because whites without a college degree, through specialized training and access to opportunities, are given opportunities simply because they're white. That has absolutely nothing to do with the levels of educational attainment. And it gets reflected both in the value of their housing units and their incomes. And that's just an aside that I wanted to stress, that we have a lot of work to do in unraveling racism, and that we got to get away from holy grails that will somehow transcend racism. And we have to get away from that because racism is embedded with privilege. And racism, residential segregation endures because white people make money off of it. And that's a hard truth. And most of them are making money off of it. And until we confront that reality, we'll run into some challenges in terms of undermining it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. I want to thank the DEI event subcommittee on behalf of Darlene and I. So this would not be possible without your hard work. And I want to thank of course, Fred Kowal, our president, our board, and all the officers for their commitment to this large endeavor. And lastly, if you do not have we would love you to join a DEI committee on your campus. And if there's not one, please reach out to Darlene, myself, or to the offices on your campus. We want to make sure that every campus has a DEI representative so that they could join, so we could really make next year a more exciting than this inaugural year. And this was absolutely exciting. So I want to applaud each of you, the panelists, and thank you all, the people who came here to join us. So Fred, I don't know, any last words?
None at all. You closed us off very well. I would instead hand it to Darlene if she would have anything to close with. Darlene?
I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being a part of this. the persons who not moderated, who were part of the presentation today, they're just on every level. Okay, so here's one takeaway that I have on this. The concept of power, that people don't realize the power that they have access to. Perhaps if we were to help educate our communities to understand the power behind their vote. Now, not just voting, not just getting a person into a winning position, but the expectation and the consequences of not fulfilling what is expected. That's the power that I feel many of us do not use. Okay, so that's one takeaway from me, the issue of the power that we do have. The other is the discussion on the environment. This is a new topic. When I say new, many individuals are not comfortable yet in understanding the consequences of the effects of environment, whether it be the factory that's nearby your house, some of those structures for electricity that I know are consequential to causing cancer, a lot of housing conditions that people who don't have the money are subjected to, because those that have the money speak up and live elsewhere. So that's housing and environment, that's voting and education, and the issue of the funding that's required for housing. So all of these topics, yes, they've given us a lot of food for thought. And within the confines of the union that we represent, I think this has given us some thoughts. To the panelists, if there's any final statement you'd like to make, I know we're running over a few minutes, but if you'd like to say something, George Nicolas or whoever else, please, 2 seconds, say something, and then we will say goodbye.
Thanks for the opportunity, and let's continue to be in conversation about how we can create the kind of society we want to live in, not allowing others to create a society they want, but us creating the society that we want. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll close
Dr.
by saying
Taylor?
I appreciate
Okay.
I appreciate everyone's time. I'm not hard to find, so let's continue the conversation. But more importantly, instead of just conversing, let's make sure that our actions are trending in the right direction. So let's continue to dialogue and continue to work.
Thank you. And
Yeah, I just
Taylor.
want to echo the sentiments of both George and Tehran. And that is that now is the time, I think, that UUP and others, we really need to discuss how we can begin to collaborate and work together to create a better, more democratic and just society. We have this fourth moment, but the moment will pass, and it's our responsibility to seize the time, cast away our illusions, and prepare to fight to build the type of America we want.
And are entitled to. And with that note, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much. I hope I see you again. Bye-bye.